Mr. Speaker, sir, I rise pursuant to Standing Order number 57-2 to make a statement on the occasion of the 10-year anniversary of the Senate. Mr. Speaker, sir, I expected if senators were concentrating to applaud that this House has lived to see its 10th birthday, the second session of the Senate. It's not by chance, Mr. Speaker, or rather guaranteed that this House, given the kind of challenges that we've had over the years, both from within and without, that we'll live to see these days. On March the 28th, 2013, the Senate of the Kenya held an inaugural sitting, technically marking the second Senate after the first Senate under the Independence Constitution was disbanded in 1967, and the first Senate under the 2010 Constitution. This second Senate, Mr. Speaker, under the leadership of Speaker Right Honorable Ekwe Othuro, EGH MP, marked one of the most significant milestones in the country's constitutional history. The coming into being of the Senate heralded a new dawn for our legislature, hitherto unicameral, and was now comprising the National Assembly and the Senate. The term of the second Senate ran from 28th March 2013 to the 15th of June 2017, Mr. Speaker. Needless to say this, that the Senate was sailing in uncharted waters. None of the political leadership and the senators who had earlier had a clear idea of what their task entailed. They had to learn how to swim by actually swimming. It was trial and error at first. However, the Speaker and his leadership team guided the unity of purpose and the will to actualize devolution, initiated work, systems, and spearheaded a series of retreats, workshops, and seminars that rapidly crafted the framework of transacting and administering the Senate. Mr. Speaker, sir, to entrench its place, the Senate began its mandate by fighting for its space and its place in the new organization of government, including its relationship with the National Assembly, in executing its mandate as contained in Article 96 of the Constitution. To name just but a few of those memorable times, in the 11th Parliament was an entrenching mandate of the Senate in the consideration of the annual Division of Revenue Bill, a matter that was eventually determined by the Supreme Court in favor of the Senate, the infamous advisory opinion number 1 of 2013. The second Senate, among its other milestones, Mr. Speaker, set in place the procedure to be followed upon the receipt of resolution from a county assembly on the impeachment by assembly of a governor or a deputy governor. This marked the stage for the first impeachment hearing of a county governor, which happened in 2014. Mr. Speaker, sir, the term of the third Senate in the 12th Parliament commenced on 31st August 2017, with 67 elected senators taking the oath of office and electing the Right Honorable Ken Lusaka, MP, as Speaker. The third Senate represents the consolidation stage of the Senate. Some fundamental achievements of the third Senate include the determination of matters such as the admissibility and constitutionality of the powers of a deputy governor in running county government business, where the governor is charged in court or is away for extended periods due to other reasons. Other fundamental achievements include measures to resolve the stalemate on the delayed enactment of Division of Revenue Bill and its impact on the county finances, and the implication of the High Court judgment on the Constitutional Petition 284 of 2019 that challenged the laws that were enacted and procedural. That remains to be one of our memorable days of this House, Mr. Speaker, last Parliament, when we all walked hand in hand from right here in the Senate chambers all the way to Milimani Law Courts. And I see many colleagues in the House today who made the infamous march, Mr. Speaker. That day secured our place in history, Mr. Speaker. Had we not pushed back on an executive fully backed by the National Assembly that was keen on extinguishing this House, Mr. Speaker, I am not sure whether we'd be here gathered this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. I celebrate all the senators that joined us on that graceful march that morning. Mr. Speaker, sir, in the third Senate, we initiated inaugural sittings of the Senate outside Nairobi. Actually, should be in the third Senate. We initiated the inaugural sittings of the Senate outside Nairobi, commonly dubbed Senate Mashinani. These sittings showcased and entrenched the place of the Senate as an institution mandated to represent and protect the interest of counties and their governments, as highlighted in Article 96 of the Constitution. So far, Uasin Gishu and Kitui have hosted and will continue with this practice, and we shall continue as a Senate with this practice into the future. You are aware, Mr. Speaker, that I think 2 weeks ago, I did move a motion in this House, and colleague senators were gracious enough to agree with me that we carry on with this program, and there is already set in place a technical committee that is scouting for the ideal venue of the third edition of the Senate Mashinani. Mr. Speaker, we look forward to that edition later on this year. As you may recall, Article 96, Mr. Speaker, 6 of the Constitution of Kenya provides the Senate determines the allocation of national revenue among counties. Article 176 of the Constitution establishes the county governments which are mandated to perform the functions stipulated under Part 2 of the 4th Schedule to the Constitution. Under the principles of devolved government, the county government shall have reliable sources of revenue to enable them to govern and deliver services effectively. One of the major achievements of the Third Senate was a fight for increased resources for counties. Consequently, we have observed a consistent increase in shareable revenue from Kenya shillings 190 billion in 2013-2014 financial year to the current Kenya shillings 370 billion for financial year 2022-2023, representing a consistent annual average growth of 35%. Mr. Speaker, that was an important fight that we fought together as a House. The infamous, or the rather famous in the Senate, revenue formula debacle that lasted a good 10 weeks, Mr. Speaker. With all the intrigues and all the challenges that came with it, senators stood firm in this House. And thanks to Senate fighting together as a House, we had a steep jump in resources allocated to counties. In fact, the previous year, 2020-2021 financial year had been 316 billion. But thanks to that fight, we were able to grow it to 370 billion in the subsequent financial year, courtesy of the good work that senators did. Another hallmark of the Third Senate was the consideration and the passage of the third basis for revenue allocation among county governments. Through robust debates, the Senate emerged stronger than ever before and demonstrated its commitment. Mr. Speaker, these 10 years have not been without its challenges, but the Senate rose to the task and committed to upholding the principles of democracy, transparency, and accountability. This milestone marks a decade of dedicated service to the people of Kenya, as the Senate has played a vital role in shaping the country's legislative and governance agenda. Through its oversight role, the Senate has ensured that the public resources are used for the better of Kenyans and has held public officials accountable for their actions. As we commemorate this milestone, Mr. Speaker, we recognize the hard work and the dedication of the current and former senators who have worked tirelessly to ensure that the Senate remains a strong and effective institution. We acknowledge the support of the Kenyan people who have placed their trust in the Senate to represent their interests. Mr. Speaker, just reflecting upon, I thought as well on some of what many might consider to be among the highs, just as I've listed quite a number, and what perhaps where there is a high, Mr. Speaker, there has to be a low. The world and life generally is sinusoidal. It rises and it falls. And I remember quite a number. The passage of the security laws, Mr. Speaker, Amendment Bill of 2014, quite a difficult and a challenging time for us in Parliament. The passage of the revenue generation sharing formulas, the three of them, Mr. Speaker, have been quite a challenge in this House, Mr. Speaker. I have been lucky to witness all three, Mr. Speaker, and I know while each has been unique and has had its own difficulties and nuances associated with dividing anything money-related, Mr. Speaker, Each has been unique, but I'm glad that on all three occasions, Senate emerged the winner. Of course, the first and the second Senate Mashinani sittings in Kitui goes down as a high. Mr. Speaker, the suspension of the Senate sittings in solidarity with senators arrested over the second generation revenue sharing formula. That was quite a high. We came together and pulled together close ranks across political party divides, Mr. Speaker, and ensure that our colleagues who had been arrested in the course of their duty were brought back to this house before debate could commence on anything, Mr. Speaker. That was quite a high. It's not every day, Mr. Speaker, that colleagues close ranks and fight for each other. Oversight of the county, oversight of county governments and assemblies by Senate committees are quite an important exercise that we partake through our various committees, Mr. Speaker. Well-coordinated impeachment processes bringing order to county governments, Mr. Speaker. We have saved governors on these floors. We've hanged some, Mr. Speaker. Both very difficult experiences. On days where we have acquitted some, hasn't been easy. Gone most of the times, Mr. Speaker, we've had to sit until very late at night. There are some that we've sat up to almost 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning because of statutory deadlines, Mr. Speaker. But all in all, we guided the specific county assemblies in the right way, complete with a exit report from the committee or the plenary, Mr. Speaker, guiding them on what to do and handle a particular situation. What are some of our laws, Mr. Speaker, as a House, the past 10 years as I reflect and think through? Quickly off my mind, Mr. Speaker, I remember the stalemate with the National Assembly and the national government over the division of revenue bill. Quite famous in the 10th Parliament, Mr. Speaker. No, the 11th Parliament, where National Assembly was grappling with appreciating that Senate had arrived, we were the new kid on the block, and we were ready and willing to defend the place of devolution in our constitution. And therefore, on many afternoons, the National Assembly spent useful public time discussing individual senators as opposed to our position and what we stood for in the family of devolution, Mr. Speaker. It hasn't been an easy time. Secondly, of course, arrest of senators, colleagues, Senator Cleophas Malala, Senator Christopher Langat, and Senator Dr. Lutumbesi Lelegwe over standoff on related to the passage of second generation formula. That was quite a difficult time for us as a House, but I appreciate what we did together. All of us, those that were in support of the formula as proposed, those that were against, we all stood firm and said the state had taken their game too far. And until we were given a credible explanation of where our colleagues were, they were unconditionally released, that's when debate resumed, Mr. Speaker. Of course, Council of Governors and Senate standoff over oversight funds, especially conditional grants, and the High Court judgment limiting oversight mandate of the Senate. That was quite a low, Mr. Speaker. I must speak of it. And on that afternoon, when we retreated back to reflect on the judgment of the High Court, where the judge, in his finding, tried to limit the role of the Senate in oversighting funds to the specific counties, which funds we could go through, that was a difficult moment. Because on one hand, Mr. Speaker, you have the public charging at you and demanding of you that you're the senator for Siaya, senator for Nyamira, senator for Nyandarua. What are you doing as Governor XYZ is misappropriating public funds? The courts on the other side are telling us that you cannot do that on certain specific things that ordinary citizens don't understand. All they want is to see public money spent prudently. That was quite a low time for us. Of course, delay in constituting of committees and changes in leadership position for majority and minority side. We've had this fight, this particular session on the minority side. For a greater part of last term, we had this particular challenge on the majority side, Mr. Speaker. Not a very easy time when people have got to let go of leadership position, Mr. Speaker. Hasn't been an extremely easy time. And perhaps over time, this is a question that Senate needs to resolve, because much as it is difficult here in the Senate, more difficult in the county assemblies. And they draw from the experience in the Senate. I know for a fact that there are county assemblies, Mr. Speaker, that up to now, session, just trying to resolve who is a majority leader. And therefore, it's a challenge to us as a House, because we are the protectors and the custodians of devolution. Thinking about this, Mr. Speaker, perhaps either by legislation or provide a clear guidance on how to achieve on the positions of leadership here in the Senate as well as in our county assembly. Of course, failure by governors in the 11th Parliament to honor summons, quite a number, many have been fined. Unfortunately, in the Powers and Privilege Act, we haven't provided for how to, we don't have the mechanism. You know, Parliament and Senate doesn't have, we cannot send our sergeant at arms to go and arrest governors who have refused to show up or have jumped bail, haven't paid their fines. We need to think through and consider that. Of course, removal of senators from office was quite a difficult time for us as well. You remember the case of Senator Mwaura, Senator Professor Kindiki, Wetangula, and Senator Kangata. That was quite a difficult time for us. Of course, delays of processing of Senate bills during the 11th and 12th Parliament. We haven't faced this challenge yet. I have to be optimistically cautious, Mr. Speaker, so that I don't get ahead of myself, because I know how, I've been around fairly long enough to know that when it's all rosy when you're beginning terms of Parliament. But as you get deep and deep into the term, and there are disagreements between both houses, then the urge to withdraw or to ignore the Senate, rather, Mr. Speaker, clicks in. And on those occasions, you find that Senate ends up suffering. Mr. Speaker, finally, just as a way of concluding, and this I have picked randomly, I am just reflecting on colleague senators that we've had the privilege of serving with over the last 10 years, and moments and things that they did that will remain forever etched in the memory or the history of Senate, Mr. Speaker, for those acts have defined us, who we are today and what we shall be in the future. Number one, Mr. Speaker, Senate Speaker Ekwe Ethuro. I know for a fact, and I speak like this, Mr. Speaker, because I belong to his side of the political divide, then and even up to now, that part of the reason why he lost his job as Speaker of the Senate, and I don't think this is something that you need to be hearing, Mr. Speaker, is that on many occasions in the 11th Parliament, he was called to defend the position of the Senate against what you'd call, quote unquote, the appointing authority. Some of them extremely powerful, Mr. Speaker. But because he stood firm in defense of this House, unfortunately, he never made it as he would have wished to return as a Speaker of this House. And I know that that's a huge price that he paid, but we continue to celebrate him. I celebrate him each day. He's one of the gentlemen who, when for one reason or the other I bump into him, I bow in honor because of what he did for this institution. During very difficult times, Mr. Speaker, including days when police officers were sent to cordon the House of Parliament. He stopped debate for close to 30 minutes until police officers moved away from Parliament. And of course, you know who had sent police officers then. It's not an easy decision. That seat that you sit on, Mr. Speaker, sometimes calls on you to make very, very difficult decisions in defense of this House, Mr. Speaker. And for that reason, I celebrate Senator Ekwe Ethuro. Secondly, the Senator Professor Kindiki served as our first majority leader on this side of the House where I lead, had the privilege of serving under him as a new senator, guided many of us that were new to Parliament then, even though even him was his first term of Parliament, had quickly learned the ropes and guided us, afforded us the opportunity to lay a firm foundation, and I believe that is what has guided many of us to secure and set up a firm foundation. Of course, he led in the institutionalizing of bipartisan approach on matters concerning the role and the place of Senate on devolution. That is something which, unfortunately, this House still continues to grapple with. And over time, I hope, as leader of majority, together with my counterpart, the leader of minority, we shall indoctrinate the current crop of colleague senators to appreciate that while we may disagree on the politics of the day, when it comes to matters defense of devolution and the institution of Senate, we fight together like brothers and sisters. We stand our ground together, and we ensure that we stand and achieve that. That is one of the leading edicts and the teachings of Professor Kindiki on this House when he spoke many afternoons to speak. Of course, the Right Honorable Speaker of the National Assembly, Speaker Moses Masika Wetangula, then as leader of minority, very interesting debates on many afternoons, Mr. Speaker. And I wish I said this when many of our colleague senators were here in the afternoon, because I continue to see in this House an unfortunate emerging trend, Mr. Speaker, where debate is losing its pace. I enjoyed those afternoons as a newcomer into this House, Mr. Speaker, where even though people are saying extremely difficult and sometimes harsh things to each other, those that were being spoken to kept quiet and allowed colleagues to make their point first before rising to counter whatever is being argued. That's a culture of debate. That's what Parliament is about, Mr. Speaker. And that's a culture which Senator Moses Masika Wetangula deeply espouses. Many afternoons kept this House entertained with his quotes from various books. Senator James Orengo, second leader of minority, Mr. Speaker, now governor for Siaya, stood steadfast in his defense of the Senate, together with other senior counsels from this House, defended the Senate when we went to the High Court, Court of Appeal. Unfortunately, perhaps because of his many engagements now in Siaya County, Mr. Speaker, hasn't been able to do that at the Supreme Court, Mr. Speaker. But of course, he's being ably helped by our colleague, the Senator for Nyamira, Senior Counsel, Senator Omogeni. We celebrate his work. Senator Kericho Murungi led in the quest for strengthening of oversight role of the Senate in its and the place of Senate in the Parliamentary Service Commission. And I wish I said this when our colleagues in PSC were there, because when it became untenable and we felt that we were being shortchanged by our colleagues in the National Assembly, Senator Kericho Murungi one afternoon moved a motion in this House, Mr. Speaker, to have PSC split between two, to have a PSC for the National Assembly, one for the Senate. When that agitation began, at least, though for nuisance value and very little legal value of it, Mr. Speaker, because it will never have passed in the Assembly, at least got that third, or I think it was a fourth commission of PSC, Senator Omogeni, to take Senate seriously. And after that, there was a change in attitude in how PSC treated Senate as an institution. Of course, that danger always lurks, and you must remain vigilant. Senator Fatuma Dulo led in the quest for strengthening of oversight role of a Senate, continues to celebrate her serving her second term as a woman senator. Not many women have been elected to represent counties in this House. She leads a distinguishing role, Mr. Speaker, having been elected twice to this House, of course, previously having then served as a nominated senator. I challenge to colleague senators who are nominated to know that you can start and build a stellar career from your nomination. That's what Senator Fatuma Dulo has done. Senator Kipchumba Murkomen served as Deputy Majority Leader, then later on as Majority Leader, stood steadfast in defense of Senate and devolution. I recall part of the very first committees that I enjoyed their sittings as a new member of this House was Devolution Committee, Mr. Speaker. And I wish, I don't know if Senator Abbas is in the House, Mr. Speaker, that the present Devolution Committee takes time to study the work that was done by the Devolution Committee of the Second Senate. Remember, that was a time that we were just turning the curve, Mr. Speaker, and getting into the cycle of devolution as a country. Therefore, there were many laws that needed to be passed, many challenges in the county governments. I recall the amount of work that they did. Traveled actually most of the afternoon. They missed plenary sittings, resolving disputes between governors and their deputies, county assemblies, and so on and so forth, Mr. Speaker. I wish that be the guiding spirit of the present devolution committee, chaired by the very able Senator Abbas. Senator Bill Okero, my first chairperson of the Budget and Finance Committee, a committee whose job and duty I took with utmost zeal and enjoyed serving, perhaps my best committee, the committee that I enjoyed serving in the most and gave me an understanding of the place of the institution of Senate, was under the chairmanship of Senator Bill Okero, Mr. Speaker. Served that committee, ensured that our reports, especially on BPS, Mr. Speaker, though ignored by the Treasury, will always find a way of either speaking and closing ranks with our colleagues from the National Assembly, despite the fact that those times there existed very frustrated relationships between both houses, Mr. Speaker, but also generally guided us in pushing for the place of devolution. When we began about conditional grants, Mr. Speaker, and so many amendments to the PFM, guided by Senator Bill Okero. Senator Dr. Boni Halwale, our whip, Mr. Speaker, chaired the first committee of the County Public Accounts and Investment Committee and led the committee in establishing institutionalization of oversight on county governments as contemplated in Article 96. This was the first PAC committee that dealt with county governments. Remember, CPAC before was dealing only, when we were unicameral, Mr. Speaker, was dealing only with our colleagues, with oversighting the national government. But Senator Boni Halwale led this committee with great honor and distinction. I remember the many reports that he tabled before this House. And on that, courtesy of the work that his committee did, many county governments reformed and actually ensured that there was prudent use of public resources, a culture that is quickly waning away, Mr. Speaker, and it's not something to be celebrated. I wish to challenge our colleague senators to take keen advantage of the reports, first of all, of CPIC, but second and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, even the audit reports. I see many occasions when I first came to this House, Mr. Speaker, when reports of Auditor General were tabled here by then Majority Leader, you'd see senators camper for the same, to pick a copy and see how their counties are doing. Nowadays, they lie idle, almost falling over on the clerk's table until they are carted away, Mr. Speaker, by the sergeant at arms. I think that's an area that, as a House, we need to improve and pay keen attention. Of course, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken about this, and it's something that I continue to engage my colleagues on the minority side about the need to perhaps rethink the place of oversight, to not only be reactionary to the audit reports brought by Auditor General, but even on issues that individual senators know about their counties. I am sure there can be a better process, and I proposed, and something that we haven't unfortunately been able to resolve, on that very sacred role of this institution, Mr. Speaker, can better be carried out as a complementary mechanism to what the Auditor General does, Mr. Speaker, because unfortunately, much as we think the Auditor General knows everything about your county, I don't think the Auditor General, despite the fact that they may have all the reports, Mr. Speaker, would know more about Busia County and the challenges that ails them more than their senator who's here, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, that's something that we need to perhaps make a decision about and move on motion. I promise the House, Mr. Speaker, that by the time we return after this short recess, we'll have reached a common position with the Leader of Minority and propose something to the House. Senator Professor Peter Nyang'nyong'o, then Senator for Kisumu, chaired the Committee on County Public Accounts and Investment, led the committee in establishing county oversight mechanisms, also took a lead in strengthening oversight function by ensuring cabinet secretaries and other state public officers appeared before committees when summoned to. One of the best reports that you'll read about Parliament, Mr. Speaker, on Kenya Airways was courtesy of work that was done by a special committee led by Senator Professor Peter Nyang'nyong'o of this House, with this House, Mr. Speaker. Senator Martha Wangare, now member of Parliament for Gilgil, began her career in this House as a nominated senator, has moved on to serve now, I think now, yeah, she's serving her second term as Member of Parliament for Gilgil constituency. Introduced and navigated amendment to the Employment Act, providing for the provision of pre-adoptive leave for parents seeking to adopt a child. You know, the bill was assented to and is now part of our employment law. Just the same way when you are expecting the birth of a child, Mr. Speaker, many people take leave. She introduced a very interesting proposal which senators and the National Assembly agreed to on what she called pre-adoptive leave. People going on leave as they prepare to adopt a child, Mr. Speaker. Senator Mutula Kilonzo Jr. Remained steadfast in his quest for the protection of devolution, introduced legislation on the county boundaries to resolve long outstanding and delicate boundary disputes between various counties. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the county boundaries bill has never been concluded on, Mr. Speaker. It's presently before the House. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that this Senate will take time to have a rigorous debate about that particular bill this time, Mr. Speaker, especially in light of the fact that we know that IBC, once properly constituted, Mr. Speaker, has got to do delineation of boundaries in this present year. And I believe it is Senate that can guide on dispute resolution between various counties, Mr. Speaker. And this is a present challenge that exists. In fact, I struggle to imagine a county. There are very few counties that don't have boundary disputes with their neighboring counties, Mr. Speaker. And it's something that Senate can guide on how to conclude on this process. Senator Dr. Agnes Zani, Mr. Speaker, was instrumental in introducing legislation for the protection and enhancement of devolution, including the very famous Natural Resources Bill, which has been introduced this term of Parliament, I think, by Senator Danson Mungatana. I hope, Senator Mungatana, you work and conclude on that bill as soon as now, because that bill is extremely important to all of us, because each county has a resource that they share or that they give to the country. Yet, on many occasions, counties don't benefit. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, is just to remember that across this journey, we have lost many of our colleagues, and would wish just to mention them because those were extremely sad times for us as a Senate when we've had the unfortunate incident of having to lose colleagues. Of course, first was Senator Mutula Kilonzo, Senator Kajwang Senator Kajwang Gerald Otieno, Senator Kariuki Gigi of Laikipia in the 11th Parliament. Then, of course, in the 12th Parliament, last Senate, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, we lost Senator Ben Okello of Migori County. I believe after that loss, Senator Eddie tried to replace him, but was unsuccessful in that quest. Thank God he succeeded this time. Senator Yusuf Haji of Garissa, replaced by his son, Senator Abdul. Senator Kabaka Boniface served as senator for Machakos. Senator Prengei Victor, and Senator Machage Wilfred of Migori, Mr. Speaker, colleagues that we lost across the way. Mr. Speaker, I will be remiss if I conclude on that speech without celebrating. I have celebrated almost every other senator that has made contribution. Of course, I couldn't mention many who are still serving in this house, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the right time to celebrate them will come. But I want to celebrate equally, Mr. Speaker, the staff of the Senate, led by the very able clerk, Jeremiah Makoha Nyegenye, for 3 terms now, has served as clerk of the Senate, leading the first team, the first staff that put together the institution of Senate. Of course, you know for a fact, colleague senators, that their work is to make us look good. Many of the citations that we make here, the presentations that we make outside there, are presented by the very competent staff of the Senate. I know that for a fact. I have served as staff welfare, Mr. Speaker, chair, for 5 good years. And I know that you will struggle out there to find staff as competent as staffers of Parliament, especially those of the Senate, Mr. Speaker. No offense to staffers that serve in the National Assembly. I would never have said that last time, but now I have the luxury of saying the truth that staff of the Senate are extremely competent, Mr. Speaker, and they understand and know their duties and role, and on many occasions prepare a Senate. Therefore, I celebrate the work that has been done also by Jeremiah as he leads the team together with his 2 very able deputies as well, Mohammed and Eunice. They have led Senate the last 10 years quite remarkably, Mr. Speaker. Of course, with a lot of difficulty. You know, when you have battles with the National Assembly, Mr. Speaker, because it's not easy to target senators, because whatever my colleague or counterpart in the National Assembly, Kimani Ichung'wah, says to me, I can answer back because I'm elected like him. But shudder to imagine what staffers of Parliament, especially those of the Senate, go through when they are cited in the National Assembly in reports and mentioned on the floor sometimes because of inter-house battles. I don't think that has been easy for staffers of the Senate, because on many occasions they have been on the receiving end wrongfully most of the time, if not all the time, from our colleagues in the National Assembly and the leadership therein, because of the stand that the Senate has taken. It's easy to find bogeymen in the leadership of the Senate staff, mostly in the place of Jeremiah. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I celebrate and do urge colleagues that we focus on to the next 10. I know we have started with difficulties, Mr. Speaker, but I give my assurance first to the Senate and to the country that we will find our bearing, we will find our space, we will close ranks, and this Senate, the current session, Mr. Speaker, I still believe will serve to be the best Senate that has been, other than the other two, better than even the other two, Mr. Speaker, because I know for a fact with great difficulty, as I say, there's always a silver lining in every cloud. I know, of course, at the moment with all the difficulties that we are facing in the country and even with us as an institution, people may begin to imagine or think that perhaps not much will be achieved. But I want to tell them, watch this space. This Senate will achieve great things for both for country and for the various counties, Mr. Speaker. With those very many remarks, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for indulging me. I celebrate you also, Mr. Speaker, for the work that you have done in the last few months. It hasn't been easy, but I know there will be a time to celebrate you even greater once you have steered us to greater success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues, for indulging me.